Thank you for joining. Welcome, everyone. We see that there are still some more people joining in, so we'll give it another 30 seconds or 1 minute. Thank you. Great. I think we can get started. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Pierre Petit de Pasquale. I'm the Standards Director at IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And today we are offering a stakeholder feedback webinar or live consultation to inform the standard revision process of IRMA. This event is part of a series of live consultations that have been happening since the beginning of December and are still taking place for another couple of weeks. We've covered quite a lot of topics and chapters that are covered in the IRMA standard for responsible mining and mineral processing. And today and tomorrow, we are looking at some more sector-specific or phase-specific aspects of these standards. So we are focusing today on mineral exploration and development. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see, just as a reminder, so IRMA released in October last year 2 important draft standards that are out for public comment for a 90-day public comment period. An update to the IRMA standard for responsible mining. The current version, which is in force, is the 2018 version, so it's been 5 years. So we are clearly aligning our process and approach to international best practice. It's been 5 years, so we've released a new version for public comment. And noting that we've also published a new draft version of our chain of custody standard that looks at the kind of claims that can be made downstream and at the end user side to ensure the sort of movement and traceability of IRMA audited material. So these live consultations, as I said, we're looking at either topics, chapters, or types of projects and operations. If we go to the next slide. The agenda for today's session will go through some of these, the basic house rules for this event. I'll tell you more about the ways that you can use to contribute today. My colleagues will then take you through also a very quick reminder about, what's IRMA so that we all speak the same language, tell you a bit more about the revision process itself, and then we'll dive into the proposed changes between the existing version of the IRMA standard, some of the initial the draft that we put out in 2021 to look at exploration and development, and that we're now proposing to integrate into one standard. We'll say more about it in a minute. And we will focus really today on the applicability of and how this new integrated standard that we propose apply to mineral exploration and development. And we'll make sure we have time for questions, answers, and a live discussion to address your feedback and recommendations. So this event is hosted, as I said, by the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It is being recorded. The recording will be made publicly available on our website and on our YouTube channel afterwards. I have to remind you that you may not post any unlawful, offensive, threatening, libelous, defamatory, obscene, or objectionable content today. Similarly, you may not post or send or link any hateful, degrading, criminal, or sensitive imagery or content, nor advocate or promote intolerance or hate against other people. And we also remind you to not post or send any spam content. If we go to the next slide. Why am I saying this? Because actually there are a number of the ways for you that you can directly contribute. This event represents one of the many opportunities and communication channels that are available, including a dedicated online platform that we have set up for you to submit your comments. But we really wanted to make sure that these events, as part of the series of live consultations, offer you a way to, actively and proactively contribute. So you can use the chat function of Zoom. Today it is enabled. It's fully functioning. You can share content, comments, feedback, concerns, questions with the whole audience today. Please note that you cannot use it in an anonymous way. So if you put content in the chat, your name will be visible. If we go to the next slide, unlike the Q&A function of Zoom, which is the other way that you can use today to submit any comment, suggestion, feedback, again, question, concern, recommendation to IRMA on exploration and development, but also on the new draft in general, the IRMA system and the mechanics. And in the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of your screen, you can submit content in an anonymous way. There is an option there that reads send anonymously, and you can just click it. I'm really inviting you all to, already, if you've already looked, if you've had a chance to look at the draft standard, if you have experience with IRMA and there are already things you want to share with us or raise or share feedback, please do it as we go along the presentation, again, through the chat or the Q&A. And everything that you share with us today with either of these channels, the chat or the Q&A, will be saved and will be considered as part of the official feedback and comments that we received on the draft. So it will be part of the standard revision process. I want to assure you that it won't be treated differently from any other formal emails or submissions or contributions. And I'll turn to my colleague Aquinar. Over to you, Aquinar.
Thank you so much, Pierre. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. So my name is Aquina Malachi, and I'm the mining sector lead for IRMA, and I am based in South Africa. So today I plan to take you briefly through what IRMA is, just to ensure that we are all aligned on our point of departure. So on this slide, we're basically just trying to illustrate how our system works, which actually happens by us providing the opportunity for our industrial scale mines throughout the world to actually participate and undergo an assessment to determine your performance. Now, the IRMA standard was developed through a very robust multi-stakeholder process, which eventually yielded the best practice on 26 different topics, which are now in our standard, which contains the 26 chapters. Now, our system works in that you get appointed independent auditors who are actually, who come to the mine itself, and then they actually do an evaluation of your mine based on the IRMA requirements, and that's the basis upon which the mine gets its performance. How is this done, you might ask? This is actually done through a third-party audit, which does include that site visit that I've just alluded to. And when they do come to site, it will require inputs from both our external stakeholders, such as our communities, NGOs, and of course, internals, and those would be your mine workers. So on to the next slide. Now, our IRMA governance system is actually a unique one in that it hosts a standard and a verification system that is equally governed across all our 6 houses. So our 6 houses are organized labor, NGO, mining, purchasing, affected communities, and investors and finance, all of whom actually have equal voting rights and veto power. And yes, that does mean, colleagues on the line, that if there are 2 representatives in any of these sectors that I've just highlighted that end up voting a no, the decision does stop, and then they all have to go back to the table and actually try to find a more acceptable solution. So in a sense, it does mean that we do not move ahead while leaving an entire house behind. On to the next slide. So the IRMA standard, as I've highlighted, highlighted actually contains 26 chapters, which, as you can see on the screen, actually cover a full range of the topics that come with industrial scale mining. So all these 26 chapters actually span across 4 principal areas, which are business integrity, social responsibility, environmental responsibilities, and planning for positive legacies. And before we move on to the next slide, one last comment that I would like to make on this slide is that the IRMA standard does not actually just contain only new content. In fact, it includes many of the best practice expectations that has already started building on existing standards, systems, and requirements that mining companies across the world are already held to. So on to the next slide. Now that we understand what IRMA is, I just want to touch briefly on the revision process that has been followed. So on the next slide, we have actually undertaken a comprehensive review of our IRMA standard, which essentially has allowed us to ensure that we remain relevant, updated. It ensures that we remain accountable to all our sectors. It also ensures that we continue to provide further clarification on the standard itself. Last but not least, it allows us to actually add consistency across and enables us to actually address any issues or identified gaps throughout this process. On to the next slide. So as Pia indicated in the opening slides, IRMA has evolved into addressing key phases of the mineral supply chain since we published our very first version of the mining standard that was released in 2018. Next click. So where we do find ourselves today is that we do have the standard that is now integrated. So it consists of the exploration and development standard, the mining standard, and the mineral processing standard. So we now have what you see on your far right, which is the draft standard for responsible mining and mineral processing 2.0, which was drafted obviously as a result of this now holistic and integrated approach. And this is the draft that we've been asking for comments in. On the next slide. So important to note before we talk about the next step is that the board has not yet approved this version 2.0 that I'm alluding to. And the reason for that, obviously, is that we now in the process of inviting comments on all the content so that we can revise and improve, working towards the final draft. Now, this draft standard that we've released actually contains what we call drafter's notes, and these were particularly included in this standard to ensure that reviewers are actually guided throughout the document so that we'll be able to actually track where the divergence is from this first version, the 2018 one, to what we currently proposing as 2.0. And in there, we've also included consultation questions, which we would really invite you to provide answers to, because this is what we'll be using to update our views, to actually guide us in terms of what the final version will actually look like. So before we move on to the next slide, for those of you who are more comfortable with actually providing comments or inputs in an Excel version, we do have it available. So it's definitely provided there for you to be able to browse through the Excel spreadsheet in the different sheets so that you can provide the inputs at your own leisure. On slide 17, for those who might be wondering what actually informed this integrated draft that we are actually proposing. So it was a range of things, a range of factors. This were ranging from experiences from the initial audits that we actually conducted, a review of other standards, review of emerging issues, and of course, comments that we received from the draft standards that I just mentioned, some of the working groups that we have, and the ongoing inputs that we continue to receive from multiple stakeholders, including these webinars that we're currently hosting. All of this combined has helped, and it's continuing to help inform this integrated draft. Now, on the next slide, I've indicated that there's an Excel spreadsheet that you can use for those who are comfortable with that, but there are also other platforms and channels that you can use that are on the screen. So just to highlight once again that we released this draft in October of last year, and the consultation period continues to be open until the end of this month. So you still do have time to actually provide those inputs, ask those questions, and just give us as much feedback as you have. And it's just important to identify that we've really gotten to that extent where we want you to have the luxury to choose which channel or platform would actually be suitable for you so that we can get that input without any hurdles. On the next slide, over to you, Pierre.
Yes, thank you, Aquinar. Thanks for taking us through the revision process. I hope it's clear for everyone. It was very clear to me, and now we'll take you through an overview of the proposed changes. So what's new in this new draft that we've put out last year in October, and then we'll look at how this actually applied to mineral exploration and development. There are a number of structural changes to the standard. So when you look at the current IRMA standard for responsible mining, the 2018 version, it only covers mining operations. As we've said now a couple of times, we have seen, identified, and it came back to us from our stakeholder engagement activities that given the huge overlap and similarities between the IRMA standard for responsible mining on the one hand, and on the other hand, the two draft standards that we had put out for exploration and development and mineral processing, that it completely made sense to unify them and integrate three standards. So that requires a number of changes in the terminology that we use. For example, one of the main example is where the IRMA standard currently talks about mine sites, we're proposing now to talk about entity. So an entity can be an exploration project or an exploration field. It can be an operational mine site. It can be a standalone mineral processing. So that allows this flexibility and universality of the standard. We have reorganized some of the content also to make sure there was a consistent flow. When you look at, in particular, the social responsibility and environmental responsibility chapters, we've always tried hard, and I think we've invested a lot of time and work and thinking in the IRMA standard to map out good and sound business practices, management standards, practices, and approaches. So really looking at a plan, do, check, act, continuous improvement approach, whether on water management, waste management, human rights management, and so making sure that the flows are similar in these chapters throughout from the very initial policy level to risk identification, impact identification, developing the management plans, implementing them, ensuring that there is monitoring and evaluation taking place against performance target, and that there is sort of continuous responsive corrective action plans happening. As Aquinar mentioned, this revision process is a wonderful opportunity for us to add clarity and fill gaps where some elements were overlooked. We've also added more consistency where criteria are, again, similar from one chapter to another to make sure the language, the phrasing are more consistent. And finally, we've removed all the language that is referring currently in the 2018 version to new mines versus existing mines. So we didn't keep that differentiation where we would have, for example, existing entities and new entities. Clearly learning from the audit processes that have been happening at now more and more mine sites and entities, it was really challenging, didn't really quite make sense to make that difference based solely on a date they came into operation. And now that we're actually able to cover, all the phases from the early exploration to the commissioning, start of operation, I think it also makes more sense to get rid of that distinction. If we go to the next slide, in terms of the high-level changes, also we are proposing a number of new chapters. We're proposing a new chapter that is called Gender Equality and Gender Protections. So to remind you that currently the IRMA standard has and addresses gender as a transversal issue. So you have gender-related requirements and criteria throughout the standard, but there isn't a dedicated chapter. So we've also heard the demands and the requests from a variety of stakeholders to both improve how IRMA addresses gender equality and the need for a dedicated chapter as well. We are proposing to add a new chapter on the management of physical stability, to manage wastes, but also materials and any other facilities. We're proposing a new chapter on land and soil management, which was clearly, or which is a gap in the 2018 standard. This is largely based and mapped on the water management chapter. All these three chapters, we've done some live consultation sessions, and you can find the recording online. The link is in the chat. We're also proposing to add a new chapter on responsible sourcing, which is only applicable to mineral processing operations. So this is not relevant to exploration and development, which is what we're focusing on today. In terms of cyanide and mercury management, which are individual standalone chapters in the current IRMA standard, we're proposing to integrate them within existing chapters. So looking more at the impacts, the risk management, and the monitoring that needs to happen in relation with waste, materials management, water, and air quality in particular, rather than having them separate to, again, avoid overlap and repetition of similar requirements. If we go to the next slide, I'll say a word about, at the principle level, so these four principles or main categories that Aquinar reminded you about. When it comes to business integrity, and I'm not going to read everything out again, really inviting you, if you haven't had the chance to look at the draft standard that we published in October, you will really find all the details, the how, the why we're proposing these changes. And back to the points that Aquinar mentioned, remaining up to date, adding clarity, adding consistency, and filling gaps. If we go to the next slide, I'll just highlight for each of the principles a couple of, if we go back, sorry, to the previous slide, right, and we see those little yellow rectangles just to highlight a couple of things on each principle. I mentioned the brand new chapter on gender equality and gender protections. And also under stakeholder engagement, we are proposing to change a little bit the approach to the public data sharing and public sharing of information, where it has proven to be very difficult to assess a number of requirements that currently are phrased as mining companies or operating companies that need to prove that information is available upon request. And now we've turned out somehow upside down, where what the entity needs to demonstrate is actually that they have informed stakeholders that they can request and obtain information, which makes more sense from an auditing and a practical perspective. If we go to the next slide, about planning for positive legacies. Here again, quite a number of changes. These are, very simplified, but they, I think, really capture the main elements that we're proposing to change. And if we just click one more time, we'll see here that in particular, we are proposing to add a number of clarification under the chapter that addresses indigenous peoples and free, prior, and informed consent, to clarify a number of things on uncontacted peoples, remedy agreements, community approval, that are mentioned in the 2018 standard, but sometimes only in the form of guidance or footnotes. And now we've strengthened that and clarified that. Also in the bottom right corner, you see here under reclamation and closure, also learning from a number of audits that have been taking place, that have taken place in jurisdictions where there is no official government overseen or supported financial assurance mechanism for reclamation, closure, post-closure. and that it has been particularly challenging. So we have made a number of propositions on how we can strengthen this and fill some of the gaps. And again, really hoping that we will get more and more comments and recommendations on these critical points. If we go to the next slide on social responsibility, and if we click one more time, we'll see here two very important things on occupational health and safety. And so everything that I'm describing here, we'll say, we'll say more about how they can potentially apply to exploration and development, but you will see that potentially most of the, and obviously depending on the how advanced an exploration project is, there many of these chapters can actually be applicable and relevant, and this is why we're mentioning them today. So in terms of occupational health and safety of the workforce, this was quite a strong chapter already, but based on a resolution that was passed last year, or 2 years ago, the ILO convention to include a new core principle on ensuring a safe and healthy working environment. This has led us to rethink and review a number of requirements and add actually 16 new requirements um, across a variety of policies, accountability mechanisms, requirements on how contractors and subcontractors may be managed when it comes to occupational health and safety, reporting, training, etc. And in the bottom left corner, you see here under conflict affected and high risk area, due diligence, we are also proposing a number of revisions to better align with the OECD guidance for responsible supply chains from conflict affected and high risk areas, which remains largely the sort of most widely and internationally approved reference for conflict affected and high risk areas. And then lastly, on the fourth pillar, principle, environmental responsibility, if we go to the next slide, please. I've mentioned already, if we click one more time, the two brand new chapters that we are proposing on land and soil management and physical stability, which allows us to separate, on the one hand, in particular when it comes to tailings, the management of the tailings per se as part of the waste management programs, and on the other hand, the stability of any facilities or infrastructures such as tailings dams, tailings ponds, but also waste rock, waste piles, and other major facilities. And here at the bottom, you see under greenhouse gas and energy consumption, it's one of the chapter really where things have changed a lot. The world has changed. Expectations have evolved. International law has evolved over the course of 5 years. So we are proposing a number of upgrades, changes to look at in particular reduction targets, renewable energy targets, and scope 3 emissions, among others. If we go to the next slide, I'll be able to now turn over to my colleague, Jim, to talk about the applicability of that. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jim Kuipers, and I'm a mining and mineral processing engineer who has been working with IRMA essentially since its inception on the more technical aspects of the standard, as well as working with them on the mineral processing standard, in addition to the exploration and development or IRMA ready standard. And so I'm going to try to, in particular, address how this standard applies, the larger IRMA standard now that has been revised into one standard, applies to the exploration and development stages. And when I get done, Pierre's going to actually talk about, from a practical standpoint, how it applies from an IRMA auditing and or consultation standpoint. But I'm just going to try to explain, separating out the various stages of exploration and development, how this applies. And importantly, one of the goals we have, and we'll show you how that's ultimately boiled down, was to make sure that we weren't asking people in earlier stages of exploration to do things that weren't necessary or weren't advisable, say, for example. At the same time, we had a situation, or we're getting comments, if you will, from civil society that they wanted to ensure that we involve the idea of early engagement throughout this process. And that's something that I think in not all cases is that something that industry has necessarily done. And in this case, I think it's very important to point out where we're suggesting it needs to be done. So the different stages and development stages, both for exploration and mine development, are taken from the Society of Mining Engineers Handbook, very consistent with industry genome and other things. However, I think there's a broad recognition that the stages in reality run across each other. As described here, and as I'll go through, each one of these exploration stages we're describing very distinctly. There's a recognition that in a lot of cases, you may be doing part stage 1, part stage 2. I think it's very important to make clear up front that if part of your project is engaging in a next stage, you really need to ensure that that's what you're requiring and not still relying on that earlier stage. And I'll explain some of the nuances of that just so it's clear. So showing here basically what I would term as the 3 different stages of exploration. Exploration stage 1 is desktop exploration. And essentially that involves, as those of you in the business know, gathering together what information you can available publicly. It might be other information you can purchase or otherwise acquire, but basically using that information to study the potential for there being an actual project on the ground. Now, for the purposes of IRMA, it's very important to recognize, and it's in the last sentence here in describing exploration stage 1, that there's a strict assumption that there are no on the ground or in the air activities or activities that presume future exploration, such as contact with affected communities or applying for permits during the desktop stage of exploration. And again, I think recognizing that that's what we're intending when we say only these requirements are applicable, it's based upon that assumption that you haven't yet engaged on the ground. And again, we're even applying that to in the air activities. Flying a helicopter over a site is not really that much different than on the ground in terms of reaction from civil society. Exploration stage 2 is essentially what I think we would describe in industry as field exploration. Initial stages of field exploration, to the great extent, it involves going in and doing on the ground work, confirming the geology, taking chip sampling, doing mapping, doing some geochemistry, perhaps some geophysics, but very important, even non-mechanized surface trenching. Very important in how we're defining it here as part of IRMA is there is no road building, mechanized equipment, other activities that actually constitute or would be likely to create a significant impact on the various resources. Now, exploration stage 3 basically is putting together all the active stages of exploration where we talk about building roads, creating access through roads or other means, and then drill pads, various other features that are common to exploration. It also includes, if it's part of the exploration development project, any underground work or surface work that might be involved, actual development work underground, any bulk sampling on the surface that creates a pit or something of that nature needs to be addressed here. It also would include something like on-site pilot processing plants in that exploration stage 3. So they're covered, and we have addressed those as part of that. So let's go ahead. I should say, if go back to that slide. I'm sorry, I did forget one key thing. Now, if you, during the next phases of mine development or even operations, if additional exploration or, for example, infill drilling is being performed, then the requirements of stage 3 are applicable to those activities. We're not asking you or expecting you to undertake the actual activities we're describing for the next stages relative to those. because again, it's not, the next stage is really involving the actual mine development itself. So go ahead to the next slide. Thanks. Now, the next stage, fourth stage, if you will, but after exploration would be actually beginning to engage in project development. And you'll notice we have two distinct things here, project development and project permitting. I think it's very important to note that project development is intended to be those stages such as development of ore reserves, conducting pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies, those activities. And I might mention very importantly, as you're doing that, collection of baseline environmental data and stakeholder engagement. Those are all the activities that we're anticipating begin with a project. And we do recognize that some of these activities, particularly stage 3 exploration project development, may not occur, oftentimes don't occur sequentially in terms of 2 years here followed by 3 years. There could be breaks in that process, various other parts. But this is intended to engage or involve, identify what you're doing relevant to the development of a new mine and a proposal for a new mine. It's not intended to address the exploration as we described earlier. Now, project permitting begins when you actually send the permit into the agencies or do whatever process that basically constitutes the same. If you were to initiate a NEPA process, or not NEPA, I should say, but really ESIA, environmental and social impact assessment, that would be part of that project permitting stage. And so that's when we more formally expect the ESIA process to be done. The public engagement process needs to be increased. And basically, again, you're addressing the proposed mining project at that point and not exploration. The next thing we're showing is construction. And I would mention that while we're describing it here, construction like reclamation and closure, as we'll describe later, we don't actually identify it in the standard as a phase for applicability. The assumption we have is that construction would be addressed under that project permitting phase, and anything that's required relevant to that would be part of what was addressed during that phase, project permitting. So next slide. Now, of course, operations is essentially when the mining and or processing of mineral resources begins. And it's a long phase, a short phase, however we might want to describe it, for various mines, various facilities. I would mention, if we could, maybe go back to the other slide, and I apologize for having to pick up on a few of these things, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned this. A mineral processing operation, the first 3 stages, of course, for exploration would not be applicable. But if we're talking a new mineral processing operation, for example, that's standing alone from the actual miner and mineral processing operations, that the project development that we describe here would be applicable for that mineral processing operation, beginning when you first start to think about that, if that were a new mineral processing operation. So I just wanted to mention that while we were going through this. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the operational stage begins when essentially you begin mining and mineral processing, producing metal and or minerals, if you will. It goes throughout the life of the mine. It would extend during interim closure of a mine site, for example, and continue until the mine site is closed. Now you notice we have reclamation, closure, and post-closure not described here when we're talking about applicability, because we don't anticipate that those activities would be something that people would audit, or something that you would look as a gap analysis after the fact. They are required during the operational phase and during the permitting phase to be developed in detail, require financial assurance for those, et cetera. But we're not intending to suggest that there would necessarily be an applicability directly to, if I'm to have a mine site just under reclamation, they would pick up the IRMA standard and look to audit that site in some fashion. So next slide. So folks are aware there is a draft applicability guidance available on the IRMA website. And we're very interested in getting your feedback on these various stages, how we've described them and what is applicable. We recognize that this is something where we took our best cut at it based upon an initial round of feedback from both industry as well as civil society. But it needs more feedback, and we definitely are hoping that folks have an interest and take the time to do that. Next slide. So again, I think I already mentioned, but it does not address applicability for construction, reclamation, closure, and post-closure phases. As I described, we would look at those being addressed under other requirements. And let's see, as I just mentioned, yes, the participatory process is very important to IRMA. So again, this is the document that describes the applicability, and we welcome comments. Next slide. So just to get into some of the nuts and bolts of this, and those of you who will want to look at that, we have developed two different tools. The first is a spreadsheet. And this is a good example of what you would see if you open up the spreadsheet. You would additionally see some normative requirements, perhaps for some of these different things in that spreadsheet. But this is showing what is applicable by line throughout the IRMA revised standard related to these different stages of exploration and development, as well as operations that we've been discussing. And if you go down through this, you'll see that, this is a good example in relation to water, because there's no on-site impacts, no on-site activities, even those activities during field exploration, for example, in stage 2, the water section is not yet applicable. Once you get to exploration stage 3, you'll see that a lot of the water section does become applicable to that stage because of the potential for water quality impacts. Recognize that as that potential is assessed for exploration stage 3, the onerousness, if you will, of those requirements will decrease, and it is relative. And I think this is important to mention. It'll be mentioned, I think, again. But what we've done here is make things as best we can relative to the type of activities and nature of activities during each of these stages. So we're not requiring folks to do, even though we might say yes to one of these requirements, and you can see we're saying yes to many of them for stage 3, it's only to the degree that they're applicable to stage 3 and the activities that you're performing. So in many cases, it's ensuring that while they may be applicable, in our case, they aren't, or otherwise you can explain why they don't need to be addressed in the same manner. So if we go down to the next slide. This shows, for example, in reclamation and closure planning, and just to make clear with everybody, we're not forgetting reclamation and closure, but it's during the exploration stage 3 where we're talking reclamation of those actual exploration activities that would have had on the ground disturbances, but then also looking at reclamation and closure planning during project development, project permitting, and operating. Important to recognize that during project development, the reclamation and closure planning that we're talking about here is kind of twofold. One, it's if there's any project development activities, and I described, for example, bulk sampling, infill drilling, various things of that nature, those would need to be addressed as stage 3 activities, looking at exploration. But then also the reclamation and closure planning would need to begin for any future proposed mining project. So keep in mind that we have that kind of dual situation that oftentimes occurs in that place. Next slide, please. And then this is a good example of needing to recognize where we're looking at the exploration stage 1 and exploration stage 2, and the distinction between that, doing things on the desktop at stage 1 and then engaging in on-the-ground activities at stage 2, particularly addressing Indigenous peoples' free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC as we more commonly know it. You can see here that To the extent there needs to be address of FPIC prior to those activities occurring, it's very minimal. We're looking at a policy commitment and suggesting that during that desktop, you want to identify whether there are any indigenous peoples that you may need to ultimately engage with. But at the point you begin to address, actually affect things, whether it's on the ground or in the air, etc., people recognize that something's happening. That's when we're starting to involve the entire FPIC process, as you see here. So I think, this is a good example of what's driving this distinction that we have in IRMA between stage 1 and stage 2 exploration. Next slide. And then this is, when you go through the applicability section, we've provided a table that basically provides the normative requirements. So this again is showing that for the FPIC requirements, FPIC policy is required in all phases, as I described. And you also need to have identification and engagement required in all phases. But 2.2.4.1, that section is not required, but is required once you get to operations. And you see we're showing for the rest of the chapter what is and isn't required. Hopefully between the spreadsheet and these tools we've developed, it'll allow folks to take a look at their project, think about what's required. We'd be glad to, if you want to pose a project to us and talk through with us what wouldn't be required for a particular project to think through some of this. I think that's something that we would certainly entertain at some point in the future and do that through Pierre. I'll leave it at that and turn it over to him, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim. And just to tell everybody, this Jim has been really, I think, instrumental in developing this guidance document, and it really goes. The two documents really go, hands in hands. The draft standard itself and this guidance document, which you can really see as a handbook. And in a way, while the intent of these new standards is to be able to cover all phases from early exploration to operational stage, and also cover standalone mineral processing facilities, one really need this handbook. So as Jim said, this is also up for public comments. We've been working with a number of pilot exploration companies who are already using our self-assessment tool, who have been also critical in helping us inform and process this new version of the draft. But we want to make sure that the tools, the guidance, the instruments that we are offering to the world are meaningful and are useful and are meeting your needs and your demands, who are out there, doing exploration work, or stakeholders interacting with or being engaged by exploration companies. So with everything that Jim said, you really see, and I hope you've seen how the different requirements may or may not apply to the different phases. And as he mentioned, for example, on the case of, addressing and respecting the rights of indigenous peoples, clearly there's the big chunk of the chapter that is not relevant anymore if the mapping and identification work has revealed that there is actually no indigenous peoples being affected by the project, so neither officially recognized or self-recognized. And then when you compute all these numbers together, you come up with this chart that we're putting here. So you've got this bar chart for all the stages that Jim mentioned, from the very early stage 1 exploration to the next stages, to the development, permitting, and the operations. In light green, you see actually the minimum number of requirements that would be applicable if all these exemptions are granted, if evidence is provided that says there wasn't indigenous peoples identified, there is no existing artisanal mining activities taking place in or around the area of operation, you're not that mercury, cyanide are not relevant, etc., etc. You see it goes as low as 57 requirement as a minimum for the first stage, up to 69. And if you do the same up until the project development and permitting phase or stages, where they can vary from less than 300 to more than 450 requirements. Again, hoping that we, if there's a need for other tools or other interfaces for you to be able to understand and maneuver the standard, both for existing exploration projects and operations, and also for potential new projects that would like to, get and implement the IRMA system upfront. I would be very happy to develop them and work with you on that. And if we go to the two last slides, just a reminder that this guidance is by definition guidance only. This is not contractual. It won't prevent an entity that is willing to go or engage in the IRMA system to actually go through the default system, submit an application, and that there will be all these sort of scoping and collective work also with the auditing firms to ensure that there's a shared and agreed understanding on the scope of relevant requirements that are applicable to the entity. Again, based on the kind of evidence that can be provided, whether a particular chapter or sub-chapter is not applicable or not relevant because of your particular context, that still needs to happen. And in the last slide, if we go to the last slide, just a word, particularly for those of you who may already be using the IRMA system, and I'm thinking of a number of exploration companies who have been piloting this until now, the self-assessment tool, Mind Measure, will transition as with everything else. So you can see here that there's sort of the process transition. This still needs to be approved by our board, our multi-stakeholder board, once we have a new version of the standard, once we've processed all the comments, feedback that we've been receiving. And there will be a transition period, clearly, as with all standards for the sites, entities that are already engaged in the IRMA system, for new participants. What is the cutoff dates, a transition period during which entities can choose between the first version and the second version, etc. And in terms of the tools and the supporting infrastructure or ecosystem of IRMA tools, we'll also make sure that the self-assessment tool transition, that the data is saved and transferred from one version to another, of course, so that you don't need to start from scratch, that you don't lose all the valuable and important work that you would have been doing. And with that, we'll just, I think, go to the last slide to remind you again about the deadline, which is the end of this month, and remind you that there is the online platform that you can use, the other communication channels. We have a couple of questions that we wanna address, but please feel free to send more and more questions as well. We are here to answer them. We have a question. We have a couple of questions actually on coal. So coal projects. How does IRMA deal with coal projects in a world of climate emergency? It's something that we didn't mention up front here in this presentation, but IRMA has been very clear and transparent until now that thermal coal is not eligible to an IRMA audit and an IRMA assessment. Our board agreed on that quite a number of years ago. And together with the uranium, these are the two commodities where it's not possible at the moment to do an IRMA audit. Though the mines that are producing not thermal coal, but metallurgical coal can be assessed. And we have another question on, it says, sorry, Akuna, please come in.
Just to add a little bit on that, colleagues on the line. So as much as we are not doing third-party assessments on uranium and thermal coal, both are actually welcome to make use of our self-assessment tool, which is free for the first use, for the first site. So that obviously will allow you to see the entire standard and actually apply it to your site and see how you can actually improve on your environmental social practices, just to ensure that obviously you are aligned to responsible mining. So as much as at this point we cannot audit you, you are free to make use of our self-assessment tool. Thanks, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you, Akuna. This is a very important point, and we'll just put the link to the self-assessment tool in the chat right now. As Akuna said, it's free for the first project or asset that you want to put it in. So please don't hesitate to contact our IT colleagues to get your credentials. We have another question which refers to, I guess, the cost estimate. So the question reads, I'd like to know what value reference a large-scale extractive industry must pay to hire an independent audit to certify that it follows IRMA. So two things I think here that are important. First of all, I think it's important that we say it again and again and again, because it's something that changed at the beginning of last year, that IRMA does not certify mines or projects anymore. There is a verification process that allows mines or exploration, or will allow exploration project to claim achievement levels. So it's really not a pass-fail model where you have to wait for a full conformity before being able to actually go into the audit and get a certification. It is really an invitation for continuous improvement. Take entities, mine sites, companies where they are, and enter the process. That said, and because it's such a continuous improvement oriented exercise, it is also, and I think Aquinar could tell you more. Please comment when I'm done saying what I'm going to say. It is really a transformational exercise for the entities that are going through the IRMA audit process. So depending on the scale, the complexity of the sites, I know of a number of mines who've been, investing just for the audit parts. And of course, there can be, internal costs also associated to the staff, the time that you want to invest in the process more largely. But they've spent just over $100,000 into the auditing process per se, and the certification, well, the auditing firm. And others have paid, more than that. Sometimes you can double that cost. We're expecting that for exploration project, in particular at the earlier stage, this would cost a lot less, because once the policy and the initial identification has been done, there will be many, many elements that actually won't be applicable. There will be a lot less documentation and information to be reviewed by the auditors. I'm also imagining that the on-site visit might be also shorter. Aquinar, if you have any comments, please.
Spot on, Pierre. You're very spot on, especially for exploration, because the requirements are considerably much less than what we deal with mining operations. Of course, both the site, the type of site, as well as the scoping. So that will be determining how many requirements are actually applicable. So it might not be the full suite, which you'd find in those 26 chapters. So of course that, and obviously some logistical arrangements depending on your jurisdiction, where you are, and how long the auditors will be on site for, again, because it won't be that full suite with that full on mining audit. You won't need as much. So it's very difficult to just give one specific price. It can range anything between 100, 150 to 200,000 US dollars. So it really varies, but it's around that range.
Thank you, Aquinar. I see that time's running off, and I think we've answered and addressed the questions in this session. I really hope that it was informative. I'm reminding you that there are 16 more days for you to send your comments, contributions. If you need a little bit more time, we can always discuss and negotiate. So please don't hesitate. Don't feel shy about it. And
Thank you.
this session will be recorded, as we said. Also, don't hesitate to share it with colleagues and others who are interested in understanding and applying the IRMA standard to exploration and development
Yeah.
projects.
And Pierre, a quick one just to mention, which we didn't mention when we were presenting, is that all the comments that we will be receiving will be considered objectively and equally. And please rest assured that your comments will be treated confidentially if you request or if you so desire. So we're really looking forward to getting all those comments, those questions and inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Akunar. This is a very good point. Absolutely. And we thank you all for your participation. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.